March 7th is probably one of the most aesthetically pleasing to look at characters in Honkai Star Rail, but at the same time there's that conflicting Primogem design that reminds me of darker times. As this game's mascot, I'm really happy with how she's presented as a character though, with her bubbly personality and snarky clapbacks. But even more than that, I'm glad she's so strong, because even for free-to-play players, she can carry you through some of the hardest content in the entire game. With that said, welcome to my guide on March 7th, where I'll explain how she's insanely strong as well as her best builds and answer questions that you might have about her. My name is Braxophone, and let's talk about March 7th. Before any of this gets started, this entire guide's gonna be biased because she has pink hair, so I really like her a lot.
Do you think the hair that comes off is pink?
March's basic attack is pretty weak and doesn't really break much, but it's more meant as a form of skill point generation than anything else. What makes March 7th OP is her versatile kit, starting with her skill, where she gives an ally character a powerful defense scaling shield for 3 turns. Now imagine, you're a monster, you're just chilling in a ship, minding your own business, having a good time, when the world's happiest girl and an actual raccoon roll up and start calling you names. That'd make you pretty mad, right? Well, that's basically what happens when March applies a shield to an ally. It raises your ally's taunt value, which is basically the equivalent of asking enemies to hit that ally. This allows you to have some control over who gets hit or takes damage for the team. With someone like Clara, who counterattacks after being hit, March is an absolutely insane synergy with her because you can farm Svarog's damage while it's not even their turn. It is worth noting that this effect turns off under 30% HP, so you shouldn't be in lethal range most of the time. Also, whenever an enemy hits your shield, March deals a counterattack scaling off of her attack stat up to twice per turn, which also helps her generate more energy. The counterattack energy really adds up too, which helps March get her ultimate, which is the other part of her kit that's broken. Her ultimate deals AoE ice damage to all enemies based off of her attack. But the kicker is that she has a 50% base chance to turn enemies into March 8th. This also deals ice damage at the start of each turn. Her insane ability to freeze enemies while also providing taunt and a powerful shield makes her an incredibly useful unit for almost all content. Wait, did you think that was all? Nope, she has one more thing that makes her broken. Her Trace Purify makes it so that your shield will remove a debuff from an ally, meaning that you can cleanse allies of status afflictions with a skill you're probably already using on them. Having a shield character with a cleanse is absolutely insane, and I'm glad Hoyo made her so viable in all sorts of content. She has other traces too, like defense increases, one to extend the duration of her shield, and one to increase her ult freeze chance, and they're all useful as well. Her out of battle technique also has a 100% base chance to freeze a random enemy for 1 turn, which can be helpful to get a head start in something like Simulated Universe or Forgotten Hall. Overall, March is an amazing unit for free-to-play and pay-to-play players and is definitely worth investing in. I'd recommend leveling her skill trace, since that'll get you more defense scaling, but for her normals, counterattack, and ultimate, you can get around to them whenever works best for you. Before I show you how to build March 7th, I want to quickly go over her Eidolons, because if you do manage to get any of them, it may affect how you actually choose to build her. Her first Eidolon is actually a really solid utility for March. After you use her ult, every enemy that gets frozen will generate her 6 energy. Though she only has a 50% base chance to freeze targets, in a best case scenario where you freeze 5 targets, that is 30 energy back to her bank, which is 1/4 of her ultimate gauge. When you combine the bit of energy that you get back with the energy you also get from her counterattacks and skills, she can sometimes even get her ult back a turn earlier. Her Eidolon 2 is a free shield to your lowest HP ally right at the start of fights, which is not only helpful because it doesn't cost a skill point, but also because there are some fights where enemies will outspeed you from the get-go, and this can save that character in a bad situation. E3 levels up her ultimate and basic, which is probably the least value of her Eidolons. Her 4th Eidolon lets you trigger counterattack 1 more time per turn, and also gives a partial defense scaling. The extra counterattack is nice, but you might not end up getting a 3rd counter often anyways, but when you do, that's 10 more energy. The big thing from this constellation though is partial defense scaling on her counterattack, since her build is strongly influenced by defense. It's going to increase her damage by a decent amount. Her E5 levels up her skill and talent, which is pretty solid, and her E6 is probably her biggest change. It turns March into a pseudo healer, which gives her allies with a shield from her HP back at the start of every turn. Now this healing is based off of the ally's HP, so March's personal HP doesn't matter much. But with that said, overall, E6 ends up being incredibly strong for your teams, but it also won't be enough to sustain your team alone in high-end content unless you have a specific sim universe build for it. It all depends on the content that you're doing and your team build, but I would argue that in harder content, March's healing alone won't be enough to get you by, but there's definitely things you can do to build around it. I'm not going to tell you to pull for March Eidolons because it's hard to guarantee 4-star copies, but they are very good, and if you get copies of March, then you'll have quality of life improved by a fair bit. So next up, let's talk builds, and I'll go over how to get the most out of our Primogem mascot. If you're like me and March 7th won you over with pink hair, I mean, that's kind of what did it for me, then you probably want a builder. So let's talk about it. If you're early game like most people, you just want to focus on getting as much defense as possible without worrying about sets. This is because March 7th as a shield bot scales on defense, and you want her to be nice and strong so that way your shields can be nice and strong. If you can manage to throw 2-piece Purity Palace on her and 2 other pieces with defense main stats, that can be enough to make her shield pretty strong, and it can carry you in earlier content. Once you start farming relics around TR 40 or whenever you decide to do it, this can change a little bit. You want to get 4-piece Knight of Purity Palace, which is going to increase your defense by 15% and the max damage your shields can absorb by 20%. This isn't like retracing Bolide in Genshin where it only works on the wearer. This effect applies to shields created by the wearer. It's going to get you the tankiest March 7th shields and allow for the most safety and counterattacks. With that being said, because March is a support character who specializes in keeping your team alive and freezing enemies, her main stats can be pretty flexible. In my personal testing and opinion, while going full shield bot can be comfier, March's ability to freeze enemies shouldn't be overlooked. The best build for March 7th in late game is using effect hit rate body, speed boots, defense percent sphere, and an energy regen rope. Real quick, let me break this down. The reason effect hit rate is a better build on March is because March's freeze by default only has a base 50% chance to land. However, freeze is a strong utility that delays enemies and therefore not only mitigates some damage that you would be taking, but also allows you more breathing room with your decision making and slows the pace of the fight. Freeze has saved me countless times in higher end content, and a higher chance for freeze to land is super helpful. If you also have March's E1, you get more energy back for freezing enemies, which means that you'll also have a much easier time getting back your ult with effect hit rate. Now you can always go with a defense percent body instead of effect hit rate, but for reference, here's a chart showing March's shield with effect hit rate versus a defense body at level 80. As you can see, the difference in running effect hit rate over defense is pretty minimal to begin with. Now for your planar ornaments, the best option for her are things like Fleet of the Ageless, which will increase all of your allies' attack by 8% when March reaches 120 speed, which will be covered by speed boots immediately. Alternatively though, another solid option for March is Belobog of the Architects, which will massively increase March 7th's defense if she has over 50% effect hit rate, which if you use the body piece actually isn't that hard to get. You'll already have 43% from maxing it out, and you can get the rest from substats. So to wrap up, an endgame best in slot March build will use 4-piece Purity Palace with defense percent or effect hit rate on the body and speed boots. The planar ornaments will be Fleet of the Ageless for attack or Belobog of the Architects for personal defense, with a defense sphere and an energy regen rope. Now lastly, for substats, you're just going to want to focus on a couple things: effect hit rate, defense percent, speed, and break effect. And just as a heads up, I would not expect to get a solid crit build on March. The Preservation actually has quite a few powerful Lightcones you can use even as a free-to-play player, but I'm gonna go over them starting with her best options. Japard's Lightcone Moment of Victory is an incredibly strong Preservation Lightcone with a high base defense, a defense increase, and effect hit rate. This is easily her best option if you get lucky enough to get it. It's an insane Lightcone, and it has a ton of value. Next up, both Day 1 of My New Life and This Is Me are great Lightcone options for March. This Is Me is a Battle Pass Lightcone that has high base defense and increases your defense as well as ultimate damage by a portion of the wearer's defense. Take a shot for every time I said defense. This one is particularly good because of the base stats, but Day 1 of My New Life is also great because it reduces ally damage taken, which makes the utility of shields even stronger and massively increases the value of having March on the team. Now outside of those, We Are Wildfire is going to be your best free-to-play stat stick option, and Trend of the Universal Market, though it has low base stats, can add a bit of damage output to your team. One last really solid option option is the 3-star Amber, which has really low base defense, but can give you 32% defense bonus unconditionally, and another 32% defense when you're below half HP, which can also affect how many hits that your shield can take. It would be much better if the base stats weren't 75% of the 4-star options, but it's still a solid early game and free-to-play option. Now, personally, I don't like Landau's choice, and a lot of people ask me questions about it in my Lightcone video. Providing taunt is great and all, but March 7th isn't necessarily the one who wants taunt on her all the time, depending on who you're playing. And it also does not provide a defense stat bonus and has the lowest 4-star base stat option. You can use it if you want March to be the one to taunt enemies, because running Landau's choice on her as well as her personal shield will definitely get her attacked, but I just think there's better options. That said, it might be for you. Texture of Memories is the free-to-play Lightcone from the Simulated Universe store, and I don't recommend this one either just because its effect only applies to the person with the Lightcone itself, so the damage reduction only works on March. The stats on it are okay and you can use it if you have it, but I'd recommend We Are Wildfire and better Lightcones before it. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that Lightcone is useless because it's absolutely not, but for most of the game you're probably not going to use it, and when we get to endgame and you're just looking to create beefy shields for your entire team, that one becomes a little less effective. Now there will definitely be more Lightcones to cover in the future, but for now, those are your best options. So March 7th is a support character that you can kind of run with any character in the game. She's an extremely flexible unit that has a lot of value, and I'm going to basically just talk about some of her synergies, but just be aware that team building for March is kind of not something you have to put a ton of thought into because she's just good in most cases. So here we have a team with March on the far left, and now I want to make a point about this right now as opposed to later. If you have tanking characters or characters that have taunts, you want them to be on the far left or right of your team. The reason for that is that there are enemies that can do attacks that hit one target and adjacent characters. So if you're using a character that has taunt, you put them on the side and only one character will get hit with the adjacent damage as opposed to two. It's really important to put your tanks or characters that are taunting on the sides. And in this case, I'm putting March 7th on the side. However, one of her best synergies in the entire game is actually Clara. And Clara is a character that doesn't necessarily have the strongest taunt in the world, but wants to be hit. Well, I mean, I don't think she wants to be hit, but you want her to be hit so that she can do more damage back. She has a follow-up attack with Svarog, where Svarog just does a ton of physical damage back, and you can actually use March's taunt to add it to Clara, and then Clara will be able to deal more damage as a result. And Clara actually has insane damage potential if you play her with March. This is March's best synergy, hands down, and these two are characters I would definitely pair together. Now that said, you can actually, if you're using Clara and you're going to be using March's shield to taunt on Clara, you put Clara on the outside and you can put March over here on the inside right next to Clara, so that way if Clara gets hit, March has really high defense and can tank some of that damage as well if she has to take adjacent damage. But if not, you can also put March on the outside on the other side, and that ends up being fine too. Outside of that though, March's team building isn't really super insane. The main thing with March is that you're going to be trying to use her to keep your squishies alive, and actually in endgame, it's possible that you won't even have to run a healer with her in some content, specifically because her shield is so dang strong. Since you're running speed on her as well, she has more opportunities to shield or to attack. It's a toolbox, and she also has opportunities to freeze, which will allow your characters like Dan Heng, Sila, Yanqing, and all your other damage dealers to deal more damage. Now, one thing that's worth noting about March is that with destruction characters, she can work fairly well because destruction characters are bruisers or they're a little bit more tanky. They have higher HP. So March with Arlen actually isn't too bad because Arlen wants to be on low HP. So once Arlen gets to low HP, you can shield him up, or you can shield him up preemptively and he'll lower his own HP as is. And so March and Arlen can actually work pretty well together. But outside of that, it really is just personal preference. The thing is, March is a tanky character that you're going to use to survive as often as possible, but there's no right or wrong way to run her since she's going to be the one keeping you alive for most of the time, and she's kind of a shoo-in in most teams, at least as of launch of the game, where there's not a lot of other good tanking options. Now, one thing I will say is that if you want to run a team without a healer, you can actually tag team March up with Fireblazer. Fireblazer's shields aren't that strong, but these two shields can work together in tandem, and with both of these characters, you are a lot more likely to sustain yourself and survive. You can go ahead and give March's shield to any character that you want taunt. In this sort of scenario, I wouldn't necessarily put Clara in here because Clara wants to take a bulk of the damage. And if you're going to be using March's shield, you can either combine that with MC or with Seele to protect them, and with MC specifically to add more taunt to MC and to make MC more likely to be hit. So in a Clara team, this is less effective, and I would actually replace Clara with someone else. Since MC doesn't use a lot of skill points, and because March doesn't use a lot of skill points either, but Seele does, we can choose a more skill point heavy character. Like if we wanted to, we could go ahead and add Serval, and this team would survive a lot of damage, quite a bit of damage, have AoE clear, have single target clear, and actually be an overall decent team. The same deal applies to Danheng or Yanqing if you want to use them. If you need lots of ice break, you can also run something like Yanqing, and you could also run Pela, and things like this will work out fairly well because March has so much sustainability. In this instance, I would be careful with Pela because Pela also requires a lot of skill points. But yeah, basically all of this is to say that March is extremely flexible and can fit into most teams that you might want to use her in. I would recommend either going with her and a healer just to be safe at the time, but when you end up min-maxing, you can go the double preservation route just to not have to run a healer while also still dishing out a little bit of damage. And the main thing is that you just want to acknowledge how many skill points March is going to use compared to your other characters. If she's your solo preservation unit and you don't run a healer, she's going to use a lot more skill points, and therefore you have to use less skill point intensive characters. You can bring someone like Seele, but then you have to use some more balanced characters because she's going to be shielding a lot more in a team where she's solo preservation with no healer. But if she's in double preservation, or if she has a healer with her, she's going to be using her basic attack a lot more frequently, and then you can run super skill point heavy characters like Bronya Seele. That combo is amazing as well. So I know that was a lot of information, but all of that was basically just to say that it doesn't really matter what you do with March a lot of the time because she's such a strong unit that can be shoot into most teams and get a lot of value. If you play her solo, she's going to use a lot of skill points. If you don't play her solo, she's not going to use a lot of skill points, and you can focus on raw damage dealers. So with that said, March 7th is an absolutely amazing and broken character. I definitely think that she's underrated by a bunch of the community and by a bunch of content creators because characters like Japard and Fire MC exist, but all three of those units are insane, and March with her ability to freeze becomes an amazing utility all the time in most teams. I highly recommend you build March. If this video helped you out at all, make sure to like so that YouTube knows the video doesn't suck, and subscribe if you want to see more Star Rail content. I really enjoy making it. And lastly, if you want to see some Star Rail stuff, come check out my stream, twitch.tv/Braxophone. I appreciate y'all. Have a wonderful night or day, or wherever you are.